Thank you for joining us in this first of a series of podcasts that I'll be doing on different aspects of COVID-19, the current situation and the future for Wales. And joining me in this first, where we'll be concentrating on the economy, is David Buttress, I'm glad to say, founder of JustEat, of course, but also chairman of the Dragons, and a proud and passionate Welshman, a strong supporter of Welsh independence, and I'm sure we'll have lots of interesting things to reflect upon, both for Wales now and, of course, in the future as well. So, David, just starting with where we're currently at, how do we rebuild the economy? The crisis, of course, has been a healthcare crisis, but it has had a massive economic impact. So how are we going to rebuild the economy in the weeks and months and indeed years ahead? We'll start with an easy one, David, obviously.
Yeah, that's a nice, simple question to start with. Look, so I think it's good to step back a bit and contextualize. So what is it really? What is the impact? If you look at, I think if you look at some of the data the OECD have put out, the reality is every month that goes by, output is contracting by 2%. So it looks like, across, so let's say it lasts 6 months, the really sharp decline, looking like for most Western economies, a sort of 10, 12% dip, although I've seen high numbers as high as 20, 25% dip. But I think when you annualize it, it'll end up being a relatively also sharp recovery, and I'm sure we'll talk to some of the tactics around how we get back to a sharp recovery. But so I feel like it'll be a 10, 12% decline. I don't think we should underestimate that. If you think of that's about 10 years growth, roughly, post-financial crisis. So we're basically giving up all that growth off a very sharp decline. So I don't underestimate the impact of that. But equally, what I would say to people is the way we deal with that is not to do what the US is doing. I think helicopter dispersing of capital through the economy is not a smart way to do this, because people that don't need help will simply save that money. They won't spend it, they'll save it, and then wherefore the money will be wasted. So I make sure, I think the EU's got a better policy, which is to invest in businesses that are clearly impacted by it, and therefore, by definition, the individuals that work in those businesses. So tourism and leisure, hospitality, and some of the industries that will be dramatically affected from the lack of people movement. So I think being really targeted about who and the industries that are most severely impacted is the smart way to do this as an economy. But I think stepping back from that, we're going to need a government to best represent, not only understand that complexity, but also to represent the people. Because one of my concerns here is, a Westminster Parliament that is focused on London and focused on, I think, largely England, particularly in an agenda of levelling up in the north of England. And I just hope that Wales doesn't get left behind in that process. My fear is that we might.
Yeah, just pausing there on the issue of the severity and I suppose the length of the economic recession. I mean, it's a bit of an alphabet soup at the moment, isn't it? Because there are people talking about a V-shaped recession with quite a quick bounce back, if you like. Others talking about a U, so a longer trough, and then a later recovery. There are some people, some commentators talking about an L shape, which was actually this current situation leading into actually a longer depression. I mean, where are you on the optimism versus pessimism scale, David?
I like to consider myself an economic realist. So I think so I would say I think it's going to be a V, but I think it's going to be a V with a longer dip down and a shorter dip up. So by definition, we'll come down a bit. I think probably the order of magnitude of 3 to 5% long term, but it will look like a V. I'm pretty confident in that. So it's not going to be like the Great Depression, where obviously we had the L. And I don't think it'll be a financial crisis, so it won't be like the U. I think it will be a V. So it'll sharp dip down for 6 months and then a sharp recovery. And the best economies and the best governments will recover their V and get back to growth quicker than the ones that are mediocre or poor. And the reason why I'd say that is, you jump back to the financial crisis. If you take Ireland as a good proxy for Wales a little bit, because of the size of economy is kind of, the Dublin area in particular is similar to the Welsh one, around 70 billion pounds. And the Irish economy needed about 120 billion euros of support post-financial crisis, which was roughly broken into 45 billion to rescue their banks and circa 75 billion to maintain services and basic standard of living through the financial crisis. So if you think about 120 billion in that period, I think the money required for Wales will be significantly less than that, and significantly less for Ireland, because I think there's the V recovery that looks like that. I think we'll end up we'll need around 25% of that sort of level. So I think Wales is going to need, if I had to guess, I would estimate on my numbers 30 to 40 billion of support in pounds to really get the recovery in the best way possible, and also to make sure and ensure, and I think politicians and business leaders have a responsibility to make sure we're clear about what the recovery is going to look like. We're clear about how we make the recovery look like that, so we minimize the impact. And thirdly, we work together to ensure that there's that level of capital support to ensure that small businesses in particular, which I think are going to be dramatically affected, retail industry, can recover, so that we do have a V that is back to where it started before coronavirus as quickly as is humanly possible.
The analogy with the Second World War, and of course coming out of the devastation of the Second World War, there was a massive need to rebuild, and that reconstruction effort was, much of it was funded, of course, through bonds, and the public responding to investing themselves in those sort of reconstruction bonds. I mean, is that something that we could look to in Wales? Maybe the people of Wales having the opportunity to invest themselves in a kind of infrastructure bond to rebuild the Welsh economy?
The first thing, I think we're going to need that kind of generational spirit, which I would argue we kind of need anyway. I think a sense of community and supporting each other is not a bad thing for any society, but that's perhaps a personal view. But I think definitely coming out of coronavirus, I think we are going to need that sort of spirit of community and galvanized society view of how we reconstruct our economy post-COVID-19. To be blunt, I think we need that in Wales anyway. Irrespective of COVID-19, I think economically we're so far behind. We almost need that spirit in Wales regardless, I think. So that's probably the first point. And that's, that for us is come out of, I think, decades and decades of economic neglect, and come out of decades of economic, I think, largely falling between the cracks in the UK as a country. So I think the second point for me is we need to have a huge capital investment project, infrastructure project in Wales, I think, for the next generation almost. You'd almost want a cross-party generational plan about how we reconstruct the infrastructure of Wales. So I think, yes, that parallel to the second one is a useful one to look at. What would that look like? Over what time period? What would the priorities be? How would we be bold about the infrastructure that Wales needs to make it fit for purpose in the 21st century? And I think that kind of leadership is the thing that will, I think, not just excite, I think, people, but will also ensure that for the next generation, we have an economy and a society that is built for purpose. Because we all know, those of us who spend any time in Wales, the infrastructure, it isn't creaking, it's actually a bit antique. So it's actually fallen behind. So yeah, I definitely would agree with that. Now, I think the third point is, how do we get that? And I think, if I think about the Westminster Parliament, I hate to keep coming back to this, but I can't help it because it is the root of the problem, I think. The realities are that this Parliament, this Conservative government, are going to be focused on levelling up in the north, because electorally that makes strategic sense for the next 5 years. They're going to be focused on ensuring London continues to be an economic global powerhouse, because that's the backbone of that part of their economy. So where does Wales come? Where's the representation that ensures that Wales gets their fair share and voice on that? And that's the bit where you rightly point out at the start, where I'm so passionate about being independent, because it's a passion yet born out of, I think, conviction based around politics and economics, that I think that any other consideration for me feels illogical, and that's where my conviction comes from.
Thinking on Wales then specifically, and I suppose one of the questions that we always need to ask ourselves, but in the current circumstance, probably it's even more pertinent than ever. In this new environment that we're going to be facing, where are our potential sources of competitive advantage? We're a small nation. We can't necessarily compete in a world-leading sense in every subsector. where do you think that we should actually be focusing in on areas where we might have a competitive advantage?
Yeah, so brilliant. So I built a business in Denmark, and I look at them, and I talked to a Dane who's a good friend of mine, who's in politics in Denmark, about their view on how do you do, as a small country, relatively speaking, population-wise, what you do. And they gave me a really great answer, and I'm going to plagiarize it. But they say it's not what you do, it's what you don't do. So it's, in other words, it's about prioritization. And so I think for Wales, strategically, part of having a look at where we want to be the big winners and be world leaders in, there's a couple of precedents for me. If I look at the Basque country, for example, they are world leaders in renewable energy. Wind energy was pioneered out of Pamplona, and then it became a huge global business that's now part of the conglomerate Acciona, which is one of the biggest renewable energy companies now in the world. So if you look at Wales, why are we not world leaders in certain industries like that? We absolutely have the expertise, we have the science, we have the natural resources. So we should, I think, look at things like renewable energy. How can we play a big role in that? Wales has a ton of natural resources. We could take some risk, we could get some things right and wrong, but nevertheless, we could have a huge ambition and a project around pushing ourselves in that area. So I think there's probably 2 or 3 areas. You look at cyber and cybersecurity and technology. We have good expertise. I don't think we're a world leader, but we nevertheless have some really good companies, a small cluster. And how do we expand and grow that and work with our universities to ensure we have engineering talent coming through that helps support the demand for talent that those companies will need, and therefore build almost a hub of expertise around that technology in South Wales. It's possible from where we sit now, but requires a 10, 15-year plan to not just expand and grow it, but then become world-class at it. And they're very different industries there. One's a heavy, big industry, and one is a technology-based industry. So there's 2 areas. And then thirdly, I think about how do we attract some world-leading businesses? Because for me, it's a bit like, how do you build things? Well, you definitely make the most of the talent you have, but you also need to bring in some talent and expertise. And I think that's through Wales having some flexibility and pragmatism about how you attract great companies. We all know Ireland has some fantastic companies, both Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, all have their European headquarters there. We all know that's for tax reasons. There's no shame in that. What that's done, though, is created tremendous wealth in the Greater Dublin area, because they obviously employ people who are, on good salaries, who are highly educated and trained people. And that creates in itself a ripple effect then out into other technology clusters in the Greater Dublin area. So I think having a policy that, is not embarrassed to attract world-class companies, and of course that might be through some tax incentive. There's nothing wrong with that, because the wider impact of that will be good on the Welsh economy through other areas of growth, and also, of course, the jobs that it creates. So I think having a 3-pronged approach around that, but most importantly, remembering sort of my Danish friend's analogy of it's what you forgo and what you don't do enables you to focus on the 2-3 things that you're going to be great at, which then over time becomes a differentiator in the economy. That is what I'd like to see Wales create a policy around and then do and build.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the criticism that you can sometimes make of Welsh Government strategy documents, I mean, is that they often have about 147 priorities. When you have 147, you don't have any priorities. I mean, on there, each one of them you couldn't disagree with, but you're not focused. Your answer really goes to one of the questions we've had in, David, from Mischief Cymru on Twitter, asking what your view is on, I love the name, on what kind of economic strategy should Wales apply going forward. And you've mentioned there some of the key elements. But just to touch on one of them, I suppose that very much come to the fore during the COVID experience is the importance of the science base to us as a society, but also economically as well. And, actually realizing how good our universities are in Wales. Some leading experts in immunology, etc. That we've got 350 research scientists in Cardiff University alone in the School of Biomedical Sciences. Important in terms of our health service, but also a vast resource potentially in terms of our economy, David.
Yeah, I'd step back a bit on this one as well and say, we ask ourselves that question, and I wonder why we ask ourselves the question. And we ask ourselves the question because I think for the last 30, 40 years in particular, Wales has been allowed to fall behind, and it's been allowed to fall behind as heavy industry rightly ebbed out of being a key part of the economy, certain parts of the heavy industry, that is, but it was replaced by nothing. And so over the last 10, 20, 30 years, we've sort of in Wales come to accept that as if that's a reasonable thing. And for me, it's completely unreasonable that over the last 30, 40 years, the backbone of the Welsh economy, certainly when I was a small boy, was destroyed and dismantled and was replaced with nothing, not even so much really as any sense of investment to meaningfully replace it. And if you go back to conviction around independence, that's why for me, to answer this question, for me, Wales has got exactly what we've discussed, a huge amount of talent. We actually out-punch our weight, to be blunt. I feel like we've been, as a country for the last 100 years, been in a fight in a global economy over the last 20 years that's evolved in particular, with one hand behind our back, and yet we still managed in some areas to out-punch our weight. So I would say there's a huge cause for confidence and optimism on this particular question, because I think if we unhinged the limitations of being attached to Westminster, I think what you'd see Wales within 10, 20 years become a world leader in one or two areas. We'd be differentiated on some key economic policies, probably around renewables, probably around corporation tax to attract world-class companies, and also I would add around innovation, around certain technologies through our educational talent that we're producing through our universities. And we would own that IP as a country. It wouldn't get diluted and it wouldn't get exported because we would control it. And I think, so for me, to answer that question is, let's sort out the first bit and get independent. And I'm massively confident if when we do, that the rest of it, the people will be see quite quickly over 10, 20 years, that it'll be the best decision we all made.
And the interesting thing is, it strikes me, David, with many of the small countries' success stories that we know from Europe, is they often have a number of common ingredients. So one of them is a strong leadership role for a very smart and agile state. Yeah. So whereas we're used to, from the British experience, the bureaucracy and the slow, speed of decision making, actually you've got smart people. You meet an Irish civil servant, and you at the leadership level, you get a sense of agility and strategic thinking. And the state is a key driver of economic success, and at the same time, you also have a strong sense, and I think you've touched on it earlier, of social solidarity, and you put those two together, and what you've got is, think of the Scandinavian countries, etc. You've got actually societies which are more equal, with a strong role for government, but also a very, very dynamic private sector. And we in the sort of British and American context, we often see these things as kind of competing. The idea of a strong, active state, equality as a key part of those societies, sitting alongside entrepreneurialism and actually helping, feed it in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we've almost had the worst of all worlds with the Labour Party in Senedd for the last 20 years, and I'll explain why. Because I feel like, as a boy that grew up in a Labour family, that if you don't understand that wealth creation, entrepreneurs, public servants, businesses, and communities are all by definition intertwined and interdependent, then politically I think you're missing something, in my view. And then secondly, the reason why I picked on the Labour Party in the Senedd the last 20 years is for this reason. One of the things I really dislike about is the lack of, I would say, direct accountability. So when I see things not growing in the economy as quickly as Wales as they should, or owning industries or becoming world class in certain industries, what I hear a lot from Labour Party leaders over the last 20 years at the Senedd is, yeah, but we're not responsible for that part of the economy, or we're not responsible for that part of the government. That's Westminster. Well, for me, that's a failure of leadership, right? Because you can't just, it might be true, by the way, but the point is, if it's not, well, then you either think then by definition, there's a problem you need to fix. By definition, then you should look to independence, or you need to do something about it in a proactive way and work within the system that you're operating within better to get a better outcome. The truth is they've kind of done neither. So if I liken it to a rugby analogy, being involved in rugby, I would say this. I feel like currently Wales, we're responsible for attack, we're responsible for the forwards, but we're not responsible for defence. So if imagine having a rugby team, and we're not responsible for the person kicking the goals. So imagine if you're responsible for attack and the forwards, you can own that, you can make sure they're doing everything they need to be doing, and they feel accountable and they're 100% committed to the outcome. If you're not responsible for the defence and the guys don't tackle and the guy who's kicking can't be bothered to kick accurately and miss the goals, then you're going to lose a lot of games and you're not going to have a great outcome. So that's for me why, if I go back to independence, we need to be responsible for all of those facets of the game, including the preparation, our strategy, the long-term talent identification and improvement. And by definition, we will be able to tackle all these problems. You can't currently tackle them when you're only responsible for 20 or 25% of the whole thing. And by definition, when I hear leaders saying things like, yeah, but we don't have responsibility for that area, what I hear is you're not responsible for anything. And that is really depressing. So that's where I get frustrated with the current setup. And that's why I think we need to devolve everything and therefore be, by definition, an independent country. And I also lastly think this, that some of those political leaders that have represented us in Wales have become almost, they remind me of the Scottish barons in the Act of Union, that they've taken their bit off the table and makes them feel good about it, but have forgotten what their whole purpose was, which is to represent people and the country in the best possible way. And when you do that in the end, I do think it'll catch up with those people. And I hope that in time people become more aware of the realities of what that's costing us as a country, because it means we fall behind.
I love sporting analogies, actually. And I often say to people, well, look, when people say Wales can't be successful economically as an independent country, I say, well, why not? I mean, we're a nation of fantastic excellence in performance in many other areas. Put a Welsh person on a sporting field, on a stage, etc. We know how to perform. We have creative flair. We're great at teamwork. We're fantastic communicators. Many of the key elements which go into any successful business, all we need is to unshackle ourselves so that energy and creativity can be just as successful in the economic sphere as it is in any other.
Yeah, we're also tolerant of noisy neighbours as well, so that's good.
Well, exactly. It all helps. It all adds to the spice of life. We've ranged very, very widely, but bringing it back to the here and now, David, if I may, just a few questions that we've had in from Abid. The way in which, asking about the way in which the crisis has highlighted the cracks in our society, particularly referring to the way that it's disproportionately affected, for example, the BME communities. And also another question in from Ivor on Twitter about how rural areas, particularly in Wales, are going to cope with the complete loss of the tourism season. And maybe in answering those, and also looking about what needs to happen, in the next few weeks and months in order to rebuild confidence in the economy, David, so that we can actually make that recovery as sharp and steep and as fast as possible.
So I'd say three quick things. So firstly, go back to my point on helicopter support versus specific support. So rural communities need specific support. Clearly the food industry will continue to do okay through this, but tourism and hospitality industries in rural areas are going to be decimated. They need specific support. So I think that talks to that point. I think the second thing around how we behave is a really great point, because I think we are going to have to show a little bit of the blitz spirit. We are going to have to accept that at some point we're going to have to get on with life before a vaccine comes, most likely. What does that mean? That means, I think, that we don't go around sort of flapping and overreacting. That means we're going to have to be cool-headed, understand how we protect each other. So social distancing, I suggest, will be here for a long time. Being responsible at our own self-management of our symptoms. So if we have got any of the things that we know, then we do isolate and take responsibility and look after and take care of each other. And lastly, that we obey in a disciplined way, the rules around hygiene that we all know help slow this virus down. So I think that's something we're going to have to own, because we're going to have to get back on with things probably in advance of a vaccine. So I think those two things. I think the third thing I would add in closing to it is that it has said something about, I think, delivery drivers. It's great the NHS, rightly so, have been lauded for their work here, because it's incredible what they're doing. But there's retail workers, delivery drivers, we all know, are actually taking pretty big risks themselves, but without the protection in many cases. So I do think employers are going to have to work with governments and understand specifically what PPE, for example, is needed in those jobs, so that we best protect those people. And then lastly, there's probably something on us which talks to community, I think, which is, we talk about, well, should these people, delivery drivers, etc., be better paid? Well, the short answer is yes, but that is also not just on the policymakers and the employers, that's on us as consumers, because I always point out to one or two members in my family who like to shop online and think it's great that the delivery's free or comes for $1.95. It's, well, that has an implication on the price or the wages of the person doing the delivering. So if we as consumers want to live in a society where we're dependent on having lots and lots of deliveries, we probably need to also accept as consumers we should pay a little bit more for those deliveries. Because actually I would say that deliveries currently, there's a dive for the bottom in terms of the price that we all are willing to pay. And you can't have it always as a society. You can't say, I want better wages, better salaries, better working conditions, and at the same time say, oh yeah, but I want my delivery for free. Okay, well, there's a thing called hypocrisy in the end, and that starts to smell like hypocrisy to me. So great that we want all these services and support, and I think we're going to need them the next 6-12 months in particular, but we should probably have to pay a little bit if we can. And I think there are many of us that can, and I think we can be smart enough about how we therefore go back to the helicopter versus specific, make sure that those that can pay a bit more do pay a bit more.
So truly valuing our essential workers, that's a phrase really that shouldn't end with this period of the crisis. That should be a kind of foundational stone for the new economy that we're going to build, and reshoring or onshoring some of that lost manufacturing bit. We've seen it with PPE, haven't we, David, in stark terms, that losing a manufacturing base can have, the most severe consequences as all. So we need to reverse that with a different economic model going forward.
Yeah, we do. And I think it says a lot about, one of my favorite places to go was Denmark and Sweden as countries. I'm a huge fan of many parts of this. And interesting, if you look at the World Survey, I think it's published in The Economist every year, I think Denmark's maybe always the most happiest country in the world, apparently, and Sweden's always 2 or 3. If you look at those surveys, well, there's a reason for that. It's because they have great healthcare. They don't have such a breadth of a gap between rich and poor, and they have a great education system. And if you take care of health, education, and standard of living, then guess what? You have a pretty happy, good country as a general rule of thumb, I would guess. Not that I know, I've never run a country, but I would assume that would be the case. And the data from that survey suggests it's true. And I think that's, for me, we could shape a Wales that looks very different to the one of today, but underpinning that is also one that is confident and ambitious. And I think that also comes a little bit back to the point around independence. And I think there, for me, lies probably the long-term answer.
Well, it's been a pleasure as always, David. We could go on for a lot longer, and I'm sure that this will be the first of many, many conversations. Despite the challenges that we're facing, I found it a very inspiring conversation. As my mother often says, it's darkest before the dawn. And in a sense, in this time, there's a lot of blue sky thinking now going around, and that's a real opportunity for us to reimagine what the future of Wales could be like.
Yeah, and I think it's cool that we all start to value our professors and doctors and nurses and people like that again. I think, the age of celebrity seems to have finally been replaced by the age of substance. So hopefully that'll stay for a bit longer.
Absolutely, and thank you for adding a lot of substance and knowledge to this conversation, and it'll be the first of many that we'll be holding over the next few weeks and months while we think about what Wales could be in the future. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd.